Something about Bridgerton Season 4 feels different. Not just slightly different, not just a new love story or a new setting. The entire energy of the show has shifted. The romance feels slower. The world looks darker. The costumes are louder. The characters feel heavier. And if you've been watching and quietly thinking, wait, this doesn't feel like the Bridgerton I remember, you're not alone. Because across fan forums, TikTok edits, and long Reddit threads, viewers are arguing about the exact same thing. Some fans say the show has grown up, others say it has lost its magic. And the truth is, both sides might be right. Because Season 4 didn't just introduce a new couple, it quietly changed how Bridgerton works as a show. From the way the stories are structured, to the tone of the romance, to the visual style, pacing, and even the emotional weight of the characters. Things that once felt light and escapist now feel more complicated, more dramatic, more serious. So today, we're breaking down exactly what changed in Bridgerton Season 4 and why fans are so divided about it. Because once you notice these shifts, you can't unsee them. Section 1. The quiet change that altered everything. Before we talk about the costumes, before we talk about the romance, before we even talk about Benedict and Sophie, we need to talk about the one behind-the-scenes change that quietly reshaped the entire show. Because the real turning point for Bridgerton didn't happen on screen, it happened behind the camera. Starting in Season 3, Jess Brownell took over as showrunner from Chris Van Dusen, the creator who had guided the first 2 seasons. And for many viewers, that change seemed small at first. After all, the sets were still grand, the music was still orchestral, the balls were still glittering with diamonds and silk. But in television, the showrunner is the person who defines the creative DNA of the series. They decide how stories unfold. They influence pacing, tone, character focus, and emotional stakes. They determine what the show is really about. And when Brownell stepped into that role, Bridgerton slowly began shifting away from the structure that made the first 2 seasons such a phenomenon. In Seasons 1 and 2, the storytelling was extremely focused. Each season revolved almost entirely on one central romance. Season 1 was Daphne and Simon. Every subplot eventually circled back to them. The tension, the scandal, the emotional payoffs, everything existed to build that love story. Season 2 followed the same formula with Anthony and Kate. Even when other characters appeared, the narrative always snapped back to the central couple like gravity pulling everything toward the same orbit. The audience knew exactly what the season was building toward. 2 people who resisted each other until they finally couldn't anymore. That structure made Bridgerton feel like a classic romance novel brought to life. But under Brownell, the show began expanding its scope. Instead of focusing tightly on one love story, Bridgerton started leaning into ensemble storytelling. Season 3 already hinted at this shift, and by Season 4, it's impossible to miss. Yes, Benedict and Sophie are technically the romantic leads, but the show no longer stays laser-focused on them. Their story unfolds alongside a growing network of other arcs. Francesca navigating grief after John's death, Violet exploring the possibility of love later in life, Lady Danbury confronting the idea of retirement and legacy, Penelope adjusting to her new role in society while still carrying the shadow of Lady Whistledown, and even the Mondrick family gaining more screen time as their social status changes. The result is a much bigger narrative world. For some viewers, this makes Bridgerton feel richer, more layered, more like a sprawling family saga rather than a single romance. But for others, it creates a very different problem. When the story keeps cutting away from the main couple, the emotional intensity of that romance can start to weaken. Moments that would have once carried the entire episode now share space with multiple storylines competing for attention. Instead of building toward one overwhelming emotional climax, the season spreads its focus across several characters at once, And that shift fundamentally changes how the audience experiences the romance. Because Bridgerton originally thrived on romantic obsession, the feeling that the entire world of the show existed just to push two people together. But season 4 often feels like the romance is only one thread in a much larger tapestry, which raises an uncomfortable question for longtime fans. Is Bridgerton still a romance-first story, or is it slowly turning into something else entirely? And once that question enters the conversation, it leads directly to the next major change, because the tone of Bridgerton Season 4 feels dramatically different from the glittering escapism that made the show famous. And that tonal shift begins with a storyline that completely changes the emotional weight of the season. Francesca Bridgerton's grief, a storyline so heavy, so raw, and so unexpectedly grounded that some viewers wondered if they were watching the same show at all. But why did this one arc alter the emotional balance of the entire season? And what does it reveal about the direction Bridgerton might be heading next?
For the first 2 seasons, Bridgerton operated inside a very specific emotional space. Yes, there was tension. Yes, there was scandal. Yes, there were moments of heartbreak. But the overall tone always leaned toward romantic fantasy. The problems felt dramatic, but they were rarely devastating. The conflicts were intense, but they were wrapped in wit, charm, and sweeping orchestral music. Even the biggest emotional moments were built around one central question: will these two people finally admit they love each other? That question carried seasons 1 and 2, but in season 4, something shifts. The emotional center of the show becomes far heavier than simple romantic longing, and nowhere is that more obvious than in Francesca Bridgerton's storyline. Her husband John's death doesn't just function as a brief plot device. It lingers. It reshapes how she moves through the world. Her grief is quiet, uncomfortable, and deeply human. There are moments where she doesn't know what to say, moments where the people around her don't know how to comfort her. The show allows silence to sit longer than it used to. Scenes that once would have been filled with playful dialogue now carry a different energy. The camera lingers on characters processing loss. And that subtle shift changes the emotional temperature of the entire season. Because suddenly, Bridgerton isn't just asking who will marry whom, it's asking deeper questions. What happens when love ends too soon? How do you rebuild a life after losing someone who defined it? How does grief reshape the way you see the future? These are questions that belong more to a family drama than a glittering romance. And while some viewers praised the show for exploring something more mature, others felt that the heavier tone disrupted the escapism that originally made Bridgerton addictive. Because for many fans, the appeal of the series was simple. It was a world where problems eventually melted away under candlelight and orchestral love songs, a world where romance always felt larger than life. But season 4 doesn't always offer that same emotional comfort. It allows pain to exist without immediately resolving it. And that shift ripples outward into the season's central love story, because Benedict and Sophie's romance is built on a much darker foundation than previous couples. Their story might look like a fairy tale on the surface: a mysterious woman at a masquerade ball, a prince-like gentleman captivated by a stranger in silver, a night filled with magic and music. It feels almost like Bridgerton's version of Cinderella. But beneath that glittering setup lies a much harsher reality. Sophie isn't simply misunderstood, she's trapped in a brutal social position, an illegitimate daughter forced into servitude. A woman with almost no power inside the rigid class structure of Regency society. And when Benedict meets her again outside the fantasy of the masquerade, that class divide becomes impossible to ignore. For the first time, Bridgerton places a romance directly against the unmovable walls of social hierarchy. Daphne and Simon faced scandal, Anthony and Kate battled pride and family expectations, but Benedict and Sophie faced something far more structural: society itself. Because a gentleman marrying a maid isn't just frowned upon, it's potentially catastrophic. It could damage the Bridgerton family's reputation. It could threaten the marriage prospects of his sisters. It could push Benedict himself to the edges of society. And that reality creates